The XTC podcast.
What do you call that noise?
Welcome to What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC podcast. My name is Mark Fisher and I am the editor of the XTC Bumper Book of Fun for Boys and Girls and What Do You Call That Noise, an XTC Discovery book, both of which are available at xtclimelight.com. But of course you know that already. But maybe you don't know that you could also lend support to this podcast if you like what we're doing at patreon.com. If you go to patreon.com/Mark Fisher, you can get the opportunity to become either a pink thing, a humble daisy, or a knight in shining armor and show your support to the show, just as Mike Smith did. Mike Smith is the very first person to give a Patreon support, and he is a humble daisy. So well done, Mike. Thank you very much for that, and look forward to more people coming our way very, very soon. We're going to try and introduce a call and response today, courtesy of David, who is with us again today, who suggests that when anybody says "shake you donkey up," there should be an immediate reply, which is quite a packet. So should we try it? Shake you donkey up, everybody.
Quite a packet.
Really?
We can work on that one, I think.
Mark was suggested, and also with you, which really doesn't quite take off, does it?
It doesn't really. Well, it did okay for Christianity, but maybe we need to move on from that.
Our a cappella group is going nowhere.
That was the voice of Jordan Cooper, who is the man behind Don't Let's Start, a podcast about They Might Be Giants. And when we started What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC podcast, Jordan was very, very quick to get in touch and say that he'd like to get in, he'd like to be involved in this as well because he likes doing podcasts. And my immediate response to that was, well, there is not only a philosophical connection between XTC and They Might Be Giants, but also a literal connection in the form of the song called XTC versus Adam Ant. So I think we're going to be circling around. I don't know whether XTC versus Adam Ant will be the beginning point or the end point of our session today, but we're going to be talking about Adam and the Ants, we're going to be talking about XTC, and we're going to be talking about They Might Be Giants.
XTC versus Adam and content versus phone, fighting for their place in rock and roll. There is no right or wrong. Just when you think it's been.
We can go in many different directions, but I think maybe, Jordan, if you could say something a little bit about your podcast to kick us off, and
Sure.
we'll find out a bit about that. It's
Sure.
only 18 months old or something like that, is that right?
Yeah. Well, first of all, can you understand my accent? I just want to make sure.
Just about.
So I have a podcast about They Might Be Giants. They're a band that I personally think XTC fans would enjoy. I'm a fan of both bands. I think they're both in my top 5. It's kind of a mix of an NPR-style documentary, infinitely long documentary about the band, mixed with me and my friend joking around and having a casual conversation. So there'd be a casual conversation and then a thing that we'll talk about that we'll mention casually. I'll spend days and days researching and finding a clip of, from whether interviews, live show, banter on stage, things that They Might Be Giants lyrics references, because they reference a lot of pop culture in their lyrics, like Sinatra movies, and there's just, so I'm always getting the clips and then I weave it into kind of this Frankenstein of a show. And we are not up to XTC versus Adam Ant yet in the show because we go at a snail's pace. We're only 3 albums in, and I've been doing the show for almost maybe about a year and a half now. But we'll get there soon, and I think this is a good starter for that. And I might put clips of this show in the future episode of my show, and that'll be a weird, disturbing cross mating thing of both podcasts, if that's okay.
Yeah, there did used to be a band called Pop Will Eat Itself, so podcasts will eat themselves.
Exactly.
We'll regurgitate. I'll bring David White in, because David, you're a self-confessed, you're not even a floodie, which is the people who only listen to Flood by They Might Be Giants. You're a complete newbie about They Might Be Giants.
All of that album, apart from the Birdhouse in Your Soul, is new to me. So up until 48 hours ago, I knew very little about They Might Be Giants. The thing that had impressed me before was the fact that they are a duo, but they have quite a full sound. I presume they just multi-track, or are they just do they act as a band? I've seen them performing as a 5-6 piece.
Yeah.
But recording-wise, is it just the two of them?
Yeah, for the first 4 albums, it is just the two of them and the occasional little guest, like one song has a drummer on it out of all those 4 albums.
Right.
And then in their 5th album, they got a band and recorded the album almost live because they were like, we're really going to be a band now. And then since that album, it's been a mix of like, let's have the spirit of the duo where we can do anything we want and no restrictions, but let's get our band in on it and they could contribute. And so now it's kind of a blend. And I actually think it took them like a decade to understand that blend. Like they had a few years of the albums feeling kind of confused to me. And now they've kind of been on this confident streak of like, we know how to do this now.
Would that have been the John Henry album?
Yes. Yes, it would.
That was, I noticed how different that was.
Mm-hmm.
And was wondering, why that was so different in its flavor.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe hit the nail on the head. That's why the change of direction. I do remember getting brilliant reviews, maybe not in this country. It didn't, I think because they had, diverged a fair way from their original path. But it's easily the one I enjoyed most as I was working my way through them chronologically.
Yeah, John Henry's my favorite album. I've yet to totally reveal that on my show, but we interviewed the drummer, Brian Doherty, who also plays on XTC versus Adamant, and who also played on Cherry in Your Tree. And so we interviewed Brian Doherty. It was an 8-hour interview that I edited into 2 3-hour episodes. And he really explained why John Henry feels different. And it really is because they were kind of stuck in this cottage, kind of like how a lot of XTC productions sound in a way. They're kind of stuck in this remote location. They're getting to know each other. They're rehearsing They never rehearsed songs much like before that album. They rehearsing. And so what you're hearing is really like a band, it gives the album like an emotional quality that is usually absent from They Might Be Giants music, because there's actually like, you can only call it like soul. Like the album has like a soul to it, which I find different for them, and which is why it kind of like I listen to that album like on the last day of school. I listen to that album, when something sad happened in my life. I don't really do that for their other albums. So yeah, it does have that difference. And this XTC versus Adamant is on the album that came after that, which I kind of consider like kind of a confusing album. But I can get more into that a little later.
It's interesting that you've put your finger, Jordan, on a thing that is relevant to this conversation, because the song XTC versus Adamant is about, I think, the head versus the heart. It's about the instinctive, however you would describe it. That the song describes the sound of Adam and the Ants was very, muscular, lively, visceral. Maybe that's a better word for it. Whereas
danceable wants you to move your butt.
Yeah, and the phrase that has been used towards XTC, and I think probably They Might Be Giants as well, is often clever. It's like
terrible, annoying.
Why do you listen to that noise? And I suppose you could also say that XTC versus Adam Ant in itself as a song is quite heady,
terrible, annoying. Yeah. Well, I have a lot. I mean, if you're not done with the introductions and stuff, I have a few major points I want to get to about that song and how it relates to everything. But you can cue me when to do that.
We'll move on to that, and maybe we can go. Maybe we'll circle very in a very broad sort of way. I'm doing a sign. If anybody was watching on Zoom, you'll be able to see me doing a helicopter sign at the moment. We're going to be zooming around up on helicopter around the subject, and we will start with Adamant. And why not start with what Andy Partridge thinks of Adamant? Here's what Andy said to me earlier this week.
What do you call that noise?
And what about Adamant, actually? I mean, he falls into the same category, I suppose.
I've got to go careful because I know Chris Hughes very well. He was Merrick, one of the 2 drummers, Chris Merrick Hughes. I think Adam and the Ant. That's the busking duo. Adam and the Ants were not revolutionary. It was it was an interesting thing to stick together, the Burundi drumming style, the Burundi drumming, which I always loved. A friend of mine had years ago in the early 70s, he had a John Peel album where it was a collection of sort of field recordings of unusual music from around the world, like sort of Siamese princesses drumming on a stream, drumming on this running water. And one of the tracks was the Burundi miners, who I think it said in the sleeve notes, or did I imagine this? They were all wearing Wellington boots with bottle tops stapled to the Wellington boots, so that every time they stomped on these pallets they were dancing on, these boots gave a loud boom and a jingle ring with all the bottle caps stapled to their Wellingtons.
That sounds fantastic, doesn't it?
That's fantastic. And they were all dancing to this kind of the Burundi thing, you know. So I thought that was very fiercely inventive.
And of course, you billed yourselves as XTC, or was even Helium Kids as playing Ant music, didn't you? Before Ant music.
Yeah, we were. Every time we'd get a gig in London, we'd leave stickers everywhere or flyers saying, probably more Ant music than human. So that was definitely pre-Adam and the Ants, but that was one of the reasons that John Peel gave us a session. He got a cassette, and he was much taken with the flyer that we included with it. And it was like a fake comic cover, an American comic, because I was heavily into American comics at the time, of this sort of rotting zombie robot kissing this 1950s starlet, and it's electricity can be fun, and he's sort of buzzing, and you know, and it says down the side, insects, iron, lust, and rays. And these phrases made John Peel want to come and see the gig, because we had a gig upstairs at Ronnie Scott's club. And he turned up and offered us a session, even though we were unsigned. And the very fact that he offered us the session, and we were on the radio, on the BBC, meant that suddenly record companies were clamoring to sign us. So it was the goofy nature of the words on the flyer, and him turning up, and you know, that's what got us a record deal that started us going. It's
amazing, isn't it? And yet, if you'd ever planned your career like that, it would
never happen. Just never happen if you tried to plan it that way.
What do you call that noise?
So, Mark, that was Andy Partridge talking about Adamant. Could you tell us a little bit about, this is Mark Reed that we're talking to now. Mark, could you tell us a little bit about Adamant from your own memory, and presumably school days when Adam and the Ants were making it big in the UK charts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually was aware of Adam and the Ants when in their first incarnation. As a callow youth, I used to buy all the music papers and read them, and Adamant featured heavily in that. But that was the early days. I mean, it's similar to XTC in that he was labelled up in the punk movement and was around that time, but wasn't really part of punk. They were kind of on the extreme. They weren't quite punk, but that was the wagon that they hitched the horses to that took them along.
Which makes them more punk, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, there's a fact that...
Because they don't fit in.
I actually knew this fact, so I apologise for being a complete geek, that the Sex Pistols' very first gig was supporting a band called Bazooka's Joe, whose lead singer was Adamant, before Adam and the Ants.
So he was there.
So he was there, and he actually predated punk in a way. And Adam and the Ants went on to make Dirk Wears White Socks, I think it was called. And... that was seen as being a bit too extreme, because it's very about kinky sex and S&M, etc., whereas punk was about politics and power and nihilism, etc. But around that time, they were being actually managed by Jordan, who was part of the Sex Pistols entourage at the time. So, and I'm not reading this from Wikipedia, I just do know these sort of things for some reason, they lodge in my head.
This is why we brought you on.
And so basically, whilst he was very much of that time, he wasn't part of the scene, even though he should have been, because he had all these connections to it. And then famously, at least in my universe, Malcolm McLaren himself took over managing the band, and of course did the thing which is actually referenced in the It Might Be Giants song, of sacking Adam Ants, keeping the band and turning it into Bow Wow Wow, pulling in Annabella Lewin, who was the singer at the time, who he apparently met in a laundrette. And they went off and did a very Malcolm McLaren type thing of recording My Cassette Pet and various slightly smutty songs sung by a teenage girl sort of thing, as you can imagine, Malcolm McLaren, which Adam Ant went away to think and then came back with, well, I was trying to think of a phrase for it. It was kind of like pantomime pop. You know, he came back with all these personas. And the key thing, which Andy Partridge mentions, was the fact he had two drummers and you had this fantastic African Burundi rhythm going, which really drove the first singles. And from there, he kind of made Ant music, Dog Eat Dog, etc. And then he had huge success, became a pin-up. But, you know, even then wasn't really part of the pop world. You know, he didn't fit in there fully either. And so he went on to become the Dandy Highwayman, Stand and Deliver. I remember they did a tour where the backdrop was a big pirate ship. So, you know, him and Marco Peroni. And they had enormous success, and it lasted for ages, you know. And then he went off to America to become an actor, and didn't have such great. He had some success there, to be fair to him, but he kind of disappeared for a while. But thankfully, he had a few problems. But he's back, from what I see, recording and playing gigs and everything, and seems to be having a good time. So, but basically, for me, the comparison of XTC, as I say, is that he was around at the time of punk. He was very involved with the people in punk, but you wouldn't describe him as being, I wouldn't anyway, in a punk artist, which I think could be applied to XTC. They were around at the time. They was dragged along by that, but they were much more than punk. And I think that was just a launching pad for them.
And what you're reminding me of is something that is true of British music in the 1970s. I'm not too sure about American music in the 1970s, but it was possible to have what now sounds like very, very eccentric music that was hugely, hugely popular. You know, there was a lot of eccentric hits throughout the 1970s in the pre-punk period as well. And you kind of think, now, how would they ever get away with that? I think.
I mean, he was front page news, and this won't mean much to Jordan, but for those of a certain age like Mark and David, the fact that he had Diana Dawes appearing in one of his videos was front page of all the papers. You know, that was a major thing. It was like, how, I don't know, Nicole Kidman appearing in your video. It was like one of the leading British actresses at the time. But also it was the fact that he crossed that bridge where he incorporated the, what's the less wanky word for zeitgeist?
We'll go for zeitgeist.
Go for zeitgeist, you know, into his videos. So, but yet at the same time kept a bit of a distance. You know, he never fully engaged with anything. Even at the height of his fame, of his success, there wasn't really a scene formed around him. He didn't get loads of bands who were Adam and the Ants like. You know, he was very unique. And I think his guiding light was to keep moving. So as soon as one persona had success, he immediately got rid of it and moved on to the next one. So I saw somewhere that it was mentioned as a new romantic, which I think was very wide of the mark. You know, absolutely not by any means.
I'm just thinking he was sort of ahead of the new romantics, wasn't he? But
yeah, absolutely.
You know, he looks new romantic, but just ahead of the curve, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that by coincidence for this conversation, the one time that I saw Adam Ant and one time I saw They Might Be Giants was at the same festival at Latitude about 5 or 6 years ago. And Adam Ant was fantastic. I mean, I don't know what age he is now, but he turned up in his sort of full military regalia, you know, that sort of the traditional British red, whatever it is, twill, which as the sort of gig went on and it got hotter and hotter, he sort of started taking more and more layers off, eventually to reveal a period Adam and the Ants t-shirt that was on underneath, you know, where it had been, whether it's been sitting around since 1978, I don't know, which of course he then ripped. And It was, you know, there was still a tremendous energy. And They Might Be Giants was good as well, but they didn't do that.
Well, they're uptight. They would never do something like that. But that's why I connect with them so much.
David, do you have anything to throw in about Adam and the Ants? Do they mean anything to you?
Apart from when we're talking about Adam, his name's Stuart Goddard. Is that right, Mark?
It is indeed, yeah.
He started life as a graphic designer, or started his career as a graphic designer.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
There's hope for us. But no, I was just going to say that, wasn't it amazing when you think of the bands in that 1978-79 explosion that were on the so-called punk ticket? Very few of them really were punk bands at all. You know, you and I, Mark, saw. In fact, this was the last time I was at a social engagement. It was a month ago. Mark, you and I saw Elvis Costello, punk ticket, but absolutely not a punk. XTC, the same. And I was also thinking of the electronic crowd, such as Gary Newman. He was a punk guitarist, but fell almost by accident on the sound of synths. Decided this was the way forward.
It reminds me of a story when I was a boy. I was living at home with my parents around 77, 78, and I would order, from mail order, various albums, and every one that came, my dad would go, "Is that punk rock?" I'd go, No, it's the Buzzcocks, they're not punk rock. I'd go, next another word would come on, is that punk rock? No, it's Tom Robinson Band, that's not punk rock.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, of course, the famous day came, that never mind the bollocks, is that punk rock? Oh, yeah, it kind of is. Sorry, can't get out of that one.
Very few punk bands were actually punk bands, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, especially 'cause I was watching a sort of compilation program of it was a compilation of the first time a lot of bands from the late 70s had appeared on television. So it was like their TV debuts. And it was probably the people that we're talking about. It was Ian Dury and the Blockheads. It was I'm sure it was Costello was there. I can't remember whether XTC were there, but it was that sort of ilk of bands. And what was really noticeable was, given the sort of myth of there are play these three chords and you've got a band sort of thing, was the musicianship behind them. Certainly if you think about the Blockheads, it was just, they were phenomenal musicians, and I'm not trying to make a kind of a point that you have to be an incredible musician to make fantastic music, but I think there is a bit of a myth about who was making the most interesting music in those days.
There's a story that Trevor Horn was recording Two Tribes by Think It Goes to Hollywood, and he was a perfectionist. To this day, he maintains he's never got the mix right, and I think it was taken, for an exaggeration, about 18 months to record this one song. And at one point he said to the band, "Look, get out, you rubbish, go and clear off." And he got the Blockheads in en masse to record Two Tribes. That was what he considered, he thought they were the very best players. I'd love to hear that, the Blockheads doing Two Tribes of Frank Goes to Hollywood would be a fantastic listen.
But that's just lost that was never released.
Yeah, totally. But it shows, as you say, that, these bands that we were saying, oh, we enjoy the Blockheads, they were a punk band. Actually, they'd been around for ages and they were like really, the best musicians you could get. But it wasn't about how many notes you can play. It was that you played the right ones,
And not necessarily in the right order.
I was thinking of exactly the same thing.
Punk gave untutored bands permission to make music, or to put a finer point on it, it gave them sales of records. But Slits is probably a good example of completely untutored musicians making a good old noise, and quite an interesting noise, possibly because they were untutored, on the back of the punk permission, as it were, to play that kind of music, which there wasn't before.
And it also opened up the venues, because the venues before then, it was record companies had to get you a slot and it was all backhanders and everything. And suddenly they found out that they could sell more drink, if they let a bunch of scruffy punk teenagers in on a Friday night instead of a bunch of musos. And so all these venues opened up and these bands suddenly thought, well, instead of waiting 6 months for a gig at the Hope and Anchor, we can just say we're punk and get on the club that appears every 2 weeks at wherever.
And Jordan, I'm just thinking, when I was looking at the lyrics, I just sort of Googled, I'll just double check the lyrics for XTC versus Adamant.
Yeah, I did that too.
Well, I ended up on a website where it would been presumably given, transcribed by a fan, and there was little notes in the corner, and the note said, I know who XTC were. They were a 1980s pop band or something. I said, I really don't know anything about Adamant. If anybody could help me, please add. So, Jordan, I think you're a little bit younger than, or maybe many years younger than Mark and David and I wonder whether this is sort of this is ancient history for you to be even talking about early XTC and Adamant in a different country as well.
I can give a little background for me in XTC. I got into them around 95, 96. So I was into them when they were still doing things. And I vividly remember getting Apple Venus Volume 1. I met Andy and Colin at Tower Records in New York City. They did a signing for Apple Venus. I posted about that to the various Facebook groups here and there. But it was really funny. And so I'll say it just because it's entertaining. But Andy we posed for the photo. Andy put his fingers in my ears and he said, "Nice holes." And Colin put his marker in my ear. and it was amazing. It was kind of mind blowing. But so yeah, the early XTC stuff is like history for me. But so is They Might Be Giants. I got into They Might Be Giants around the same time, around '94.
David, did you? I gave you a little bit of homework, and I don't know whether you didn't know what I was talking about or whether you took it seriously. But I was listening to the fantastic podcast by Soda Jerker, who are two very intelligent fans of pop music who do a whole series of interviews with leading names, and they have recently released a podcast with Katie Tunstall. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about that and whether you responded to it, David.
Yeah, I think the takeaway from that, she's a very entertaining singer and guitarist, and some good songs, and she's got a good earthy vibe about her. Katie, she's from across the water in Fife.
She's a good St Andrews girl.
Good St Andrews girl.
I'm from St Andrews as well, so she's one of us.
She describes a point where, having seen Patti Smith, that was a game changer for her in terms of her career ambitions, and she realised that was what she wanted to do, and that was she put that into her hit song "Suddenly I See."
The song is entirely about the Robert Mapplethorpe photograph of Patti Smith on the cover of her Horses records, and I think the idea of that picture has stayed with me a lot through the years, because the thing I really like about it is that she's not trying. It's very, very easy. She's just being. And it's almost challenging in its lack of effort. It's going, well, who are you? This is who I am. And I'd seen the album cover before, but that night I was just looking at it and going, wow, I really would love to be in a place where I'm not trying anymore. Because I'd just been trying. And it's not a great place to be, trying. It's a commendable place to be, but from a creative point of view, you're much better off just being and doing rather than grasping. And a lot of the time when I was trying to get somewhere as an artist, the trying didn't actually work. I'd try and get the A&R people up to Edinburgh. I'd try and put on a gig and try and get people in, and it often didn't work. And actually, when things did work, it was just because I was really, really enjoying playing.
And the reason it struck me was the question of instinct and intellect and emotional heart, which is what we, as we circle around XTC versus Adamant, content versus form. It seemed to me that I might have been reading a little bit into what Katie Tunstall was saying, but she was saying once she felt. She just allowed herself not to try, actually. That's what she was doing. But she's saying, it was when I stopped trying and just sort of followed her instinct, and her instinct happened to be sort of gutsy rock and roll. But when she just did that, then all the good things started to happen to her. Whereas when she was trying to get people to see her gigs, trying to get agents, all the rest of it, it was much harder. And what she admired about Patti Smith was that certainly that appearance of, I don't give a fuck, I'm just going to do this, and follow me. And it seems to me that contrary to expectations, actually, in some cases, that with XTC, both with Andy Partridge and with Colin Moulding, that they're not intellectual songwriters. They follow their, they do dazzlingly intellectual things, but they do it from a place of instinct. I'm not going to use the word emotion necessarily, but instinct. And so the reason they end up in such interesting corners, the reason you end up with Bungalow from Colin, or The Man Who Sailed Around His Soul from Andy, is because they're just thinking, oh, I wonder what's over there. I'm just going to go there. And in a way, they're guileless, perhaps that's the right word. That they're not. It's like there's no protective layer there. They'll just think, oh, that looks interesting. They're not trying to impress.
Unafraid to follow their intuition. Paul McCartney's been described as such. In that Howard Goodall in his that fantastic program about Sergeant Pepper was saying that Paul McCartney very much followed his intuition in exploring the keyboard and trying new things out. And of course, we know how much that applies to Andy Partridge with the guitar, just a very exploratory guitarist, but quite happy to land on things by accident.
My relationship with They Might Be Giants was, I'd always heard their albums and enjoyed them, But kind of like Tom Waits, you'd listen to it, go, oh, I really like that. And then there was never a time when I thought, I must listen to some Tom Waits, so I must go and listen to They Might Be Giants.
Yeah.
You really enjoyed it, and I'm not going to be as simplistic as to say it was the emotional versus the head, whatever. That's too simplistic. But I think the one thing that they have in common with XTC to a degree is, and it's a word that some people might object to, but pastiche. It's they do try to. It's probably more noticeable than They Might Be Giants. I mean, because sometimes listening to the albums can be a bit disjointed because each track can be very different to the one before, and at times, and this may be going too far, I was reminded I was like of Gilbert O'Sullivan, Gilbert and Sullivan. The operetta folk, the way they built the songs around the melodies and the lyrics, and some of them seemed to be that way rather than the music leading to the lyrics themselves. But XTC obviously had their moments in pastiche, but then it was at a more instinctive way. They would kind of let their influences guide them to a certain area, whereas, and I could be totally wrong, Jordan, They Might Be Giants seem to be a bit more obviously trying to do it. There's a bit of a conscious effort there to do something in a certain style.
I have so many footnotes for what you just said, but I'll say a few things. I'll try to be quick. So what I've discovered in doing my podcast and talking about that exact topic a lot with my co-host, Dave, we've really discovered that it seems like, so They Might Be Giants is a duo. It's two songwriters. One of them is the one who really does that, the one who wrote XTC versus Adamant. He's the one where every song is a genre pastiche. And this was confirmed to me by one of their producers who I talked to about this. So he's just like, oh yeah, all of his songs are genre pastiches. The other one, that's John Flansburgh. John Linnell, his songs are just John Linnell songs. And like once in a while he'll do a genre pastiche, but if you really look at the overwhelming evidence, it's like John Linnell just writes songs. I think John Flansburgh is more of a recording guy. And I think he's more interested in what sounds can we do on this song? How could we, like, oh, I'm going to write a country song. I'm going to write this kind of song. So it is true, but I'd say it's only true for about half of their output. The other thing I want to say is that, so, Ween, there's bands like Ween.
Yep.
I find when Ween do a genre, it sounds like the genre. When They Might Be Giants do a genre, it sounds like They Might Be Giants doing a genre. And I think that's special. I think that's what's great about them. I don't know if they can pretend to be another genre for real if they even tried. Because their stuff, even when they do like a metal song or they have a lot of different, oh my God, jazzy stuff. They have a song that sounds like it's from like, an old jazz record from like the 30s, called Reprehensible. It still sounds like They Might Be Giants did it. Like it's not fooling anybody. Whereas Ween kind of blows my mind because when they do something like that, I'm like, wow, this really sounds like it's a jazz record from the 30s.
It's funny you mention that because at times they also remind me of the Bonzo Dog Band, who were another band who kind of took the influence back from those days. And, they're more known for doing comedy records, but actually they made a lot of really great records. And they seem to enjoy, in the same way that I think XTC and They Might Be Giants do, the challenge, the chance to do something in a different style and see what they can give to it rather than just doing it as a straight, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, to even just emphasize how obsessive They Might Be Giants are about that, they will leave out incredible songs on their albums because it kind of sounds like another song already on the album. So they don't even like having some barely similar kinds of song. They want the album to be like every track is a fully different tempo, feel, everything, because we do a lot of episodes about these like rejected songs, and I've looked up interviews with them and they'd be like, oh yeah, that was just, we didn't need another mid-tempo piano song on the album. And it's like, there are bands where every song is the same thing. XTC are not one of those bands, but even XTC, like there's a uniformity to their albums, let's say something like Black Sea, like it sounds like a band in a studio playing a set. Yeah. Whereas They Might Be Giants sounds like you're putting in a different CD for every song or whatever, tape, record, whatever is your,
So you seem to be saying that They Might Be Giants have got two key songwriters, both of whom complement each other, but write in a slightly different style. Does that remind anyone of anybody?
Yeah, no, exactly.
And actually, the other thing that Mark just drew my attention to is something that we haven't, that may become somewhere in between the head and the heart, which is humour. And
yeah.
sometimes maybe to their detriment, but because they might be giants can be considered. I presume the reason that Jordan's laughing is because they can be considered wrongly, I think, as a novelty band. But
yeah, it drives me insane.
Where that's coming from is a sense of playfulness, joviality, or whatever, and humor is certainly very strong in XTC's. Certainly, both in their offstage and on their recorded personas.
Yeah, wow. Well, the humor topic, half of my podcast is me on the defensive, being like, they're so funny, but they're not that funny. And that's kind of like what they might be giants. Like we actually said something in an episode where like, they want, like XTC versus Adam Ant is a funny song. Like it's funny. It's a absurd, it's like making it as if these two mythical gods are warring throughout history, but it's these two bands that people don't think much about. It's kind of the joke, I think. But I don't mean you, but normal people don't think much about. And so it's a funny song, but it's not funny it's not like ha funny. It's not funny like, and here's the punchline kind of funny. And They Might Be Giants, they have a lot of songs that are clearly intended to be funny, or the spark of the idea is comedic, but they hate when people laugh. Like they've said, they hate when the audience laughs. And I kind of relate. I've had shows with bands in the past where I'm doing a really sad song and people are laughing. And it's, because like similar to XTC, and, I put in some wit into the lyrics. Like I'm a big fan of the Smiths and Morrissey too. Like I like witty lyrics that surprise you. But for me, it doesn't exactly detract from the emotional, like, oh, he's being witty while talking about wanting to kill himself. Like that's to me is what life is like. Like I've had the most saddest / funniest conversations with friends about dark subjects. And so that's what I think both those bands, XTC and They Might Be Giants, are like. I think They Might Be Giants, the humor is a little more, I don't want to say pretentious, but a little more artsy and performance art, absurd kind of feel, whereas Andy Partridge's humor especially is a little more, what's a good word, like playful in a kind of cheeky way. Like he'll make a little innuendo and it'll be like kind of funny, stuff like that. Whereas They Might Be Giants are more like they'll reference an old movie from the 50s that you've never thought about, but they're referencing it in a way that twists it to be some dark, like Hope That I Get Old Before I Die is a song about hanging yourself. And it's a riff on the Who song. And it's like, that's the joke, is that, well, what if that Who song was about aging and wanting, like, wouldn't it be so punk to want to get old instead of dying? Like, so they're weird jokes. They're jokes that are hard to explain. And they're jokes that I'm not sure you can even ruin when you explain them, because they're kind of enigmatic enough that they're just outside grasps is what I'm trying. They're just outside, like you can't quite hold them in your hand. And I'd say my least favorite They Might Be Giants songs are the ones where you can be like, oh, that's the joke. I kind of get it. I like the more, when this applies to a lot of their earlier stuff, but I like the ones that are a little more confusing and disarming and unfathomable, but still funny. I don't know. That's that's a little bit about the humor in their bands.
I might be about to expose my ignorance in front of you all, but I came across a thing today about the inspiration for XTC versus Adam the Ants. Did you all see this?
Yeah.
About the fact that there were just...
I've logged countless interviews, and I have him talking about that song quite a bit, but it might be you might have found something different than me.
I don't know, I doubt it. I was just curious because they said they'd contributed a track to an XTC tribute album.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you know what track that was?
Yeah, so They Might Be Giants did a cover of 25 O'Clock, which is interesting because I actually have a clip of them on the radio years before that where a caller requests that they perform 25 O'Clock, and they're like, oh, no, we would never do that. The XTC songs are too hard. So it's kind of a weirdly ironic thing that then that's what they did a few years later. So They Might Be Giants did 25 O'Clock. I actually want to ask you guys what you think of their cover, if you know it offhand. But while recording 25 O'Clock, they wanted some psychedelic nonsense in it, similar to the Dukes. And so he's like, let's put a Flansburgh's like, let's put a backwards message in. And he couldn't think of what to be saying in the message. So he just listed off a bunch of bands. And he said Adam Ant and a few other bands. And that's what's in there. And then that got him thinking about like XTC and Adam Ant as two like opposing forces. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. But what do you guys like their 25 o'clock cover? And you can be honest.
I don't know, but I have something to say about that
Okay.
thing, and that is that we're talking about the Dukes, of course, not the XTC, but and that the Dukes, I would say, come from a rather similar. There's certainly plenty of crossover there because they are, to some extent, parody.
Yeah, that's right.
And they are also there's a strong vein of whimsy there. But I think the American whimsy that we're talking about, and that could be Tom Lehrer, it could be Sparks, which I think, and Alan Sherman, that I think really feed into that They Might Be Giants. I think it's maybe from a different route from the 1960s British whimsy, such as the Bonzos, and obviously Dukes of Stratosphere being, what do they call it? Chiku Park with small faces, that kind of thing, being rooted in a very British kind of whimsy. It's maybe the same stuff, but it's very much from a different route, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot American, and especially, I think even more, if you want to narrow it in more, New York. Like, for me, They Might Be Giants are a very specific New York in the 80s kind of dirty, absurd kind of humor, and it's partly why me and my friend like connect to them so much in a way, even though, like I said, even we don't understand a lot of the jokes. But there is, it's definitely, there's, it's almost like how you watch like a David Lynch movie and there's a lot of humor about Hollywood in it, because like that's where he's like obsessed with. And so it's like They Might Be Giants, it's New York, it's Brooklyn, especially if you want to narrow it even more, Williamsburg and Brooklyn, where they lived in the 80s. There's like a kind of dark comedy to it. There's like homeless people, but then they'll be funny and they'll come up to you and do weird shit and you laugh about it, but it's sad too. Like, there's just that weird blend of things going on. And British humor, all I know is what I know. I've never been there. I've never, but I know from being huge fans of a lot of filmmakers and TV shows and music from that time, there's, it's like it feels like wit is the good word, whereas with Brooklyn, it's more like, I don't know, guff. I don't know, like some like different kind of word to describe what the jokes are. I don't know.
And Talking Heads maybe.
Yeah.
Feed into that. And
actually, to tie it back to Patti Smith, like I wanted to throw in this one quote is that Patti Smith once, speaking of heart versus head, Patti Smith, I read a thing where she was saying how much she doesn't like David Byrne, because and this is from like a quote from like the late 70s about CBGBs and stuff. But she was like, oh, you can tell everything he does is so rehearsed. And it's like, that's right on topic here, because it's like, it really maybe it is. Is that bad? I don't know. Does that make them, it's so interesting to me. Like the idea of, David Byrne intellectualized all the weird stuff he did on stage. But and Patti Smith didn't. And I guess it's like, does that mean you can't like one more than the other? I don't know. I really don't know.
And it seems to me kind of unsurprising, but I'm making a big assumption here. It seems to me unsurprising that They Might Be Giants themselves, the Johns, should be XTC fans. But I'm assuming that they are XTC fans because they've done a cover of 25 O'Clock, which was a pretty, the answer to your question, I think it's a pretty loyal cover, isn't it? So it is. It's in the spirit of the original cover, and I think it's for all of the reasons that we're touching on, that if you're a sort of, for want of a better phrase, college preppy,
college rock,
slightly intellectual, arty, you're going to pick up on something that is not stupid. It's not the Ramones. And is it true to say that that They Might Be Giants are XTC fans?
I know. So I have contradictory interview clips. I have a few clips where they say they are, and where Flansburgh, who wrote the song XTC vs. Animate, where he says he is. I have one clip where he says he's not. So it's really weird. I think when you do a lot of radio interviews, you just are tired and you just get sick of saying things.
I've listened to your podcast a little bit, and most of your podcast seems to be saying, well, on the one hand they said this, but on the other hand they said that. They do enjoy contradicting themselves, don't they?
Yeah, I do have a clip. In fact, I can even look up the quote if you want. Let me see. XTC. I have a whole Excel sheet where I log keywords to find out what they talked about.
Don't give Mark ideas.
So they talk a lot. I have clips where they talk about oranges and lemons. They talk, he seems to be really aware of. Then there's one time where he says he's into XTC, okay, not a huge fan. He's more into Adam Ant. And then he says, style counts. You don't have to be that dignified or authentic. He enjoys Adam Ant for what he does. So I have that clip, but then I have other clips where he's like, clearly the song is preferring XTC because he's like, I'm a huge fan of, that kind of innovation in the structure and the content of the lyrics. So I don't know. It's hard to say.
I'll come back to you, but maybe that's a perfect point to play a clip of Andy Partridge talking about They Might Be Giants. So let's hear what he has to say. Here he goes.
What do you call that noise?
What do you think about XTC versus Adamant? What do you think about Adamant? And what do you think of They Might Be Giants?
Oh, you bugger.
And what do you think about the line in that song is content versus form? That's the idea, and it suggests that idea of the sort of cleverness that has, that phrase that's been thrown at you in the past.
Yeah, well, the British hate clever.
And doubly hate clever.
Well, they doubly hate clever, but they hate clever. They hate intelligence. The whole education system is put in place so you won't be too intelligent and your intelligence won't be farmed and grown. But that's another long topic of conversation. What do I think of the song? I think I've heard it twice, something like that. It's okay. I mean, I tend not to play music by our contemporaries in any way. I see every one of our contemporaries as competition that has to be stomped on in the nicest possible way. So I tend not to listen to them, and I find it difficult, probably for all the wrong reasons. I find it difficult to like our contemporaries. So I've heard it a couple of times, and I thought it was a kind of nice concept of a song,
And possibly in some ways it is quite a heady sort of song, if you like. It's like a
sure, but
it is a concept.
Everything they did was kind of heady.
Yeah.
If ever I met them personally, I'd have to talk to them about the similarities between Birdhouse in Your Soul and that Beach Boys song that I can't remember the name of.
Oh, I've never made that connection in my head.
There is a Beach Boys song, it sounds ferociously like, but I'm being a bit wicked here and bringing that up. But I heard that Beach Boys song for the first time about 5 years ago. I thought, why do I know this? Oh, it's a slower version of Birdhouse in Your Soul. But I quite like They Might Be Giants, but I mustn't be too enthusiastic because they were still competition.
They might win the competition if you're too enthusiastic. You might concede defeat.
In fact, I don't see anything in a lot of the bands that you were supposed to like that were contemporaries of ours in 77, 78, 79, 80. I really don't see anything in the vast majority of those groups. I think they were poor songwriters, poor players, with a paucity of imagination as well. So
I thought you said poor settee then. I thought
well, I had that as well. Poor settee and drossful sofas.
That was the problem with late 70s bands.
What kind of furniture I might like.
They had terrible couches in those days.
Oh, dreadful.
What do you call that noise?
So that was Andy talking about, and I'm going to have to find out what that Beach Boys song is. But they obviously exist in a similar universe, but they've kept a distance from each other, maybe.
I thought it was quite flattering that Andy called them contemporaries rather than just, I don't know, some not even in his orbit, or his radar. I mean, I consider XTC like royalty, and I consider They Might Be Giants kind of like, I don't know, the weird guys kind of like who don't live in the castle, maybe like the jesters or something. But so I thought that was really flattering of him to call them contemporaries. And I related to everything he said about not being able to listen, because I used to do open mics, and the only thing that would make me more mad than sitting through an open micer who I thought was terrible was sitting through an open micer who was great, and that I was getting so jealous and, stage fright and like, oh my God, I have to follow this person who's like winning over the audience. So I totally related to him saying that he can't even listen to They Might Be Giants, which I think is the biggest compliment in a way.
Yeah, and there's certainly the thing that I've been aware of, oddly, because of doing the Limelight fanzine all those years ago, is that back in the day when people had tapes, they would send me tapes about their band, which had been influenced by XTC, and I would say 98% of the time I never liked listening to them because they were always trying to sound like the band that you already liked. You think, well, I can just listen to this band that I've got. And I know I've heard Andy say, or in fact, maybe it was Dave Gregory saying similar things, saying, well, I'm already making this music. Why do I want to hear more of the same? Actually, what you want to go and hear is something that you can't do, some avant jazz or something. You would go in a different direction. So you don't want to hear what you already know.
They Might Be Giants have said the same exact thing when fans give them albums and stuff. And as someone who is inspired by them and has a band, like I really tried to make it not sound like someone who's a fan of them making music, except for maybe one or two moments, But that's kind of actually it was like my fourth or fifth live show. And my friend, after the show, he gave me the biggest compliment where he said, "This is the first show you've done where you can't tell you like They Might Be Giants." And I was like, that's what I wanted to hear, like I've had a lot, because of the podcast too, I've had people send me music. Like I've had fans of my show be like, check out my band. I'm hugely influenced by the Giants, and I'll listen to it and I'll really give it a listen, like while I work and stuff. And I'm like, wow, it sounds like someone trying to be They Might Be Giants. And it kind of, but the thing is, like, I'm like, the songwriting's good. Maybe it's something, I don't know, something needs to break out some, like there needs to be some sort of like a escape from the They Might Be Giants weight, and then it would be great. And, it's not easy,
Yeah, and I think one of the things about taking inspiration from people is that the danger is that you take the finished article, but you don't necessarily take the reason for that finished article being like that. So I would like, personally, this is going off on a tangent a bit, but personally, the music I would like probably has a similar starting point, but it doesn't necessarily have a similar ending point. So I like music that is exploratory, is tuneful, is intelligent, or there's vague words you could use, like, but that could end up sounding like the Super Furry Animals, it could end up sounding like Squitty Politti, or it could end up sounding like Dexy's Midnight Runners, but it's none of those things would actually sound the same.
I've said the exact same thing, and I've also said the same thing about, there's been this wave of TV shows lately that are trying to be like classic movies. Like there's the Fargo TV show. There's the show that's trying to be Fight Club. There's a show that's trying to be David Lynch. And, and I'm like, it's some of the stuff in the shows are quite good, but I'm like, but you don't have it's exactly what you said. Like you're copying an end result of something, but you're not copying the initial motivation for, like, your Fargo show might reliably give you some moments that remind you of the movie Fargo, but it's not coming from that magical, mysterious place that inspired the movie Fargo. We can never understand almost, what makes great art happen. Like we can try it ourselves. We can guess, we could read interviews where they're like, oh, this is the inspiration. I did Backwards Duke's stuff. But that mysterious thing is hard to get. But then when you see a show or a song that clearly just rips off another artist, you're like, oh, I get it. They're just like are copying someone. It just doesn't excite me as much, even if it has superficial qualities that are impressive.
We talked quite a lot about this in the first episode of What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC podcast, when we were talking about Garden of Earthly Delights, the tribute album, and
I listened to that.
And David, you've in What Do You Call That Noise, the book, you wrote about cover bands. Do these comments resonate with you?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That there's an authenticity that I mean, for as long as I can remember, that's been a big thing. Are you really speaking, or are you showing where you're coming from, your roots? And I would imagine somebody like They Might Be Giants probably gets a lot of that kind of criticism, that because they are a kind of, again, the word parody it doesn't sum them up by any means, but it does come into their culture, that they're not actually, that they are merely viewers or observers of culture rather than growing their own. And certainly in Britain, since the late 70s, the NME would have you roasted for not being real, keeping it real. And do they get that all the time? I bet they do.
Yeah, there's a lot of reviews of their albums that are like the clever, I'm doing quotation marks, the clever lyrics. And it just drives me crazy because I think the thing is, it drives me crazy, but it's also like, I get it. It's fair. It's not one of those bizarre, like I've read reviews where I'm like, okay, that doesn't even sound like anything like the band at all. But I get where they're coming from. But the thing is, the clever lyrics also have so much like existential dread and sadness in them that to me, there is like a deep quality to it. It's not just showing off how smart they are. And there are a song like I Palindrome I, it's like, one critic of them can be like, oh, we get it. You're like English nerds. You're talking about palindromes. But like the song is about a guy who kills his mom. And it's like, the reason it's a palindrome is because the mom birthed the son and then the son killed the mom. It like went back and forth like a palindrome. So it's very clever. It's very intellectual, but it's also haunting. And that's what I think a lot of reviewers miss about them, is their stuff is scary and it's sad. And on top of and the cleverness only makes it, because the cleverness kind of obfuscates. I'm trying to say a word that I don't know how to say. Because the cleverness kind of hides the scariness, it makes it more scary. You know what I mean? Because it's not like a metal band being like death and Satan in your face. It's under a layer of distancing, and that to me makes it more haunting.
So Jordan, then you've got plenty more to say about XTC versus Adamant, and in particular, maybe you could contextualize it in terms of Factory Showroom, which is the album that it comes from. And you've said earlier that it's an uneven album, in your opinion.
Yeah. So here's the thing. XTC versus Adamant is often the only They Might Be Giants song that XTC fans will hear, because it talks about XTC.
We're very shallow people, really.
This is, yeah. And well, to be honest, it got me curious about XTC when I was a They Might Be Giants fan. So it kind of works both ways, is that They Might Be Giants fans might check out XTC because of it. Though what actually got me into XTC was Andy Partridge's Hello EP, which was put out by John Flansburgh of They Might Be Giants in his CD of the Month Club. And that EP had Candy Mine, Prince of Orange, some My Round Guitar, and Snowing Angels. And that's the first XTC I ever heard, which is so rare a story, I feel.
But I was very interesting way in.
Yeah, I was blown away by those 4 songs. Like, I listened to that CD over and over and over. But anyway, so XTC versus Adamant is the only They Might Be Giants song a lot of XTC fans hear. And here's the problem with that for 2 reasons. It's absolutely not typical of They Might Be Giants, both in the way it is and its quality. And it's also, in fact, it seems exactly like the kind of song XTC fans wouldn't like. And I'll list the reasons. It starts with a blazing guitar solo. This is not common to They Might Be Giants albums, to have rock blazing, non-melodic guitar solos, because normally They Might Be Giants guitar solos are very structured melodies, kind of like with, I'd say, a lot of, XTC guitar solos.
And curiously, sorry to interrupt, but curiously, neither does it sound like Adam and the Ants or XTC, so it doesn't sound like any of them. But do you think that was a deliberate choice?
Wow.
I think so. I think so, because they Might Be Giants. I think they like to not be too obvious. There have been fans over the year. I remember on the old news group back in the 90s when the song came out, people were like, oh, the strings are kind of like an XTC song. And I'm just like, it's kind of a stretch, like a string section. But a string section, most They Might Be Giants songs do not have a string section. So that's kind of strange. The tempo is plodding, and it's a long song, and it's long for They Might Be Giants, which is it's almost 4 minutes. most They Might Be Giants songs are very up-tempo and fun and are over very quick and easy to play for someone. This song is a plodding tempo that just kind of goes on. Lyrically, while clearly we have a lot to discuss playing off the lyrics, I find it a bit slight compared to most of their other songs. You know, they have song, like I said, it's a song where you kind of get the idea. And my favorite They Might Be Giants songs are ones where you don't get the idea because it's too complicated and interesting and confusing. So it's a weird candidate for XTC fans to hear. What's ironic is the very next song on that album is my all-time favorite They Might Be Giants song, and it's called Spiraling Shape. And it's like everything great about They Might Be Giants in one package. You know, and it follows that song, and so many XTC fans probably never made it that far, and it's kind of sad in a way. I don't know if John Flansburgh, if he knew that this would happen, if he would change things. I will say I like the song. It's not that I dislike it, but it's so not a favorite song. You know, it was pretty fun live when they were playing it because it's so like it's kind of hard, you know, but it's just. It's I don't know if it's anyone's any They Might Be Giants fans' favorite song. And that album is kind of like that, where there'll be an amazing song and then kind of a song that's okay, and then it's really up and down. And they cut out about 8 or 9 songs from that album that are all fan favorites. That's kind of what I was talking about before when I said they cut out songs that are too similar. That song, like the songs cut out of that album, turned into another album that's like so beloved by everybody. So it's kind of weird. I would also say my only other last point about this is, so for me, XTC lyrics I feel like they're very clever, but for me, they're kind of hard on your sleeve. Like, I feel like Andy Partridge is kind of like an open book, right? He's kind of a raw wound. He'll write about his marriage, his divorce, he'll write about really insecure feelings about, all these things, even in early XTC, like paranoia and, and for me, the real content versus form is They Might Be Giants versus XTC. Because for me, They Might Be Giants is like the intellectual, XTC-ish thing in that song. And for me, XTC is kind of the heart on its sleeve, like pure pop kind of, thing. So I don't know if that's like an offensive thing to say, but I feel like it's a little closer to reality for me, is that XTC are like, because I've tried to get They Might Be Giants fans into XTC, and I give them a little warning where I say, oh, they're a lot more sincere than They Might Be Giants. Their songs are a little more about the joys in life or about the sadness more than about being intellectual or clever. So I've always seen the two bands as in a similar way as XTC and Adamant. So it's kind of weird. So I'll leave it. I'll throw it to you now.
I saw somebody on Twitter this week saying something like, I think they were alluding. It was just a very small tweet, but it was my reading of it was, in these days of lockdown, she was getting a lot of nourishment from the emotional songs of XTC. And I did tweet back and say, which emotional songs do you mean? Because sometimes XTC, from the outside, you might not think of them as emotional, but actually there's a lot of emotion going on.
I find Andy to be like very confessional, very like in ways that They Might Be Giants would never, never. They're so adamant about our songs are not biographical, our songs are not personal, even though they have songs that are clearly personal. Like they have a few breakup songs, songs about relationships. It's rare, but they exist.
And even sometimes Andy will hide behind a metaphor. And, when I first heard some of those songs, I'd be thinking, oh, it's just about the metaphor. He's just playing a game. And then you discover, actually, no, the reason he was thinking of, this is a bad example, but, Statue of Liberty was inspired by his girlfriend holding up an iron, and that looked like the Statue of Liberty. So it was rooted in a real place. And,
or like another satellite.
Another satellite, and his own grandfather worked on the farms and so Love on the Farm Boy's Wages is not just a sort of pleasant song about farming. It's actual a real rooted song in somebody's personal history.
Yeah, I've always seen Colin, and maybe Colin plays a little more games with like concepts and ideas, like Sacrificial Bonfire. It's like I feel like Colin's songs maybe are more like They're like weird little short film ideas, and Andy songs are more like from the gut and like I don't know. That could be totally wrong though. But yeah, I've always had to warn people that XTC songs are. I've even said like you might find some of them cheesy because if a They Might Be Giants fan is not used to songs, some of them at least are not used to songs that are so nakedly emotional, and like even just something like I'd Like That or Easter Theater, like something that's kind of full of joy. There's no They Might Be Giants song that's full of joy. I can't think of one. Maybe a few could be interpreted in that sense, but
I was interested in something you said right back at the very beginning of this podcast. Mark and David and myself are middle-aged, crumbling old men who kind of came through XTC album by album and followed that path. So I'm curious to see how someone who discovered them in 1995 then addressed the back catalogue.
I can tell you very specifically. So my first, I'm pretty sure, there's the Hello EP, which gave me a very inaccurate view of what XTC songs were like. Because I saw the Hello EP, which again is those Fuzzy Warble songs. I saw that as very They Might Be Giants like. They're just like, oh, every song's a different genre. Candy Mine is, I even had Andy Partridge and Colin sign it when I met them, and they were completely confused. Colin didn't know what it was. And Andy was like, oh my God, you have this? This is what you want signed? And I said like, oh, I love your Sammy Davis Jr. impressions. And he was like, oh, thank you. Like he knew what I meant. Because both Candy Mine and Sewing Angels have him going like, Candy Mine, we got to dig into the, So I saw it as like, oh, XTC must be just like They Might Be Giants because they do fun, but that's not, their albums were actually a lot more, I don't know, I'd almost say serious and more, like I said, sincere. So then I think Skylarking was my first, and I kind of hovered around the post-live stuff for a while, like maybe a few months or a year. Skylarking, Nonsuch, I know. My friend was enthusiastic to get me into Nonsuch, I remember. And I was like, okay, this is what they are. And then I bought White Music, and I was like completely shocked. Like I was literally in shock. I didn't think it was the same band. Like I couldn't believe it. And then, I checked out, and then I saw, okay, so Drums and Wires and Black Sea and English Settlement are the bridge between the early punk stuff and the, it's like, it actually works perfectly as like a transition, gradual transition. You can trace it very clearly. It's not like all of a sudden they were, though it kind of feels like that sometimes on Skylarking where it's like all of a sudden. But I just remember that shock of putting it in and hearing, especially like Crosswires. Like, I just couldn't believe it. But I was also like, oh, this is awesome. Because I also love this kind of music. I'm like, I was like in high school. I was like, I wanted to listen to fun, fast music. So I couldn't believe it. And I also found it really inspiring because I was like, you can change that much in your life. You can change. I mean, the Beatles had a similar, thing, maybe in a more even dense span of time, which kind of always, I can't even think about it because it's so crazy, what happened with their progression. But like, I listened to a lot of bands that had somewhat of a progression, and even They Might Be Giants, I'd say like they're kind of still doing their thing that they do, like they Might Be Giants haven't changed that much, which I think I mean that in a nice way. Like they're kind of reliable. They're not like, here's our orchestral album. Like they don't do that,
I've just thought there's one question that we should finish on, which is XTC versus Adamant. History will decide. Who was it? Was it XTC or was it Adamant? Does anybody want to make a casting vote? Or are we not yet in history?
That's a deep idea. I'm not familiar with Adamant stuff. I plan to be when I cover the song on my show. I'm going to have to listen to him all week. Or them. It's a him, right? It's not the band.
Well, it's Adam and the Ants, but...
It's Adam, yeah. Okay.
Well, it's really Adam and Marco Peroni.
Yeah, and they used to have, two drummers and so on. So yeah, there was a definitely distinctive band sound, but yeah.
Yeah, in fact, maybe some of you can help me, send me some stuff to listen to when I research that episode. So all I know is XTC, so I'm inclined to say XTC.
You're biased, yeah. Well, I think there's quite a few of us are biased here, but... But actually, it's not. I suppose that's one reason why the song is funny. Even the title is funny, is because it's not a competition, and it's possible to live in a world where Adamant exists and XTC exists, and that's still fine.
Yeah, exactly. No, Flansburgh has said about that song, like it's implied that XTC is better, but the ultimate meaning of the song is that you could like whatever you like.
Yeah.
So he kind of tries to play it both ways, in my opinion. But that's They Might Be Giant songs. They kind of contradict to themselves, and they're weird.
I was just going to say that if it is a competition between XTC and Adamant, I'll just say that Adamant released an album about a year ago. So if it's all longevity, he nips in at the end and gets the.
It's good to be alive, even if you're just
Touché.
yeah.
Jordan, let's remind
Yes.
ourselves where you can hear Don't Let's Start, a podcast about They Might Be Giants, on your normal podcast provider, I presume, but anywhere you prefer people to hand up?
It streams everywhere, iTunes, all that stuff. But the home base, where I post the episodes, it's anchor.fm/Don't Let's Start. We also have a Twitter at Don't Let's Pod. We just put out our latest episode, which I think anyone would be interested in because it's really an interesting piece of music history. We interviewed the owner of this weird club that They Might Be Giants played at throughout all of the 80s. They were the house band there. And we interviewed the owner, and he just was like this leading guy in the performance art scene in the 80s. His name was Gary Ray. And we just put that out yesterday, and it's just a fascinating piece of history. And he gave us lots of exclusive like vinyls and stuff from all these old bands that have disappeared, and we play clips of it. It was very interesting. So that's
brilliant.
going on, and the Twitter has lots of content and stuff. And I plan to really talk a lot about XTC when we get to this song and stuff. So that'll be a good crossover moment.
We'll keep on listening. David White, Mark Reed, Jordan Cooper, and me, Mark Fisher, wishing you well and safe in these strange times. And we'll be back with more What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC podcast, very, very shortly.
What do you call that noise?
Since we recorded this podcast, several more wonderful people have joined Mike Smith in going to patreon.com/Mark Fisher to support What Do You Call That Noise, the XTC podcast. In particular, the following Knights in Shining Karma, whose support qualifies them for a shout-out. So, a big, big thank you to Amy Parkinson, Dennis Locourier, Leslie Gooch, Liz Lynch, Mark Reed, Michael Sutcliffe, Nigel Waller, Robert Graham, Simon Slatehome. They're all fantastic, and of course, so are the Pink Things and the Humble Daisies, who've also lent their invaluable support. Thank you very, very much for that. See you next time.
What do you call that noise?
Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers, Jordan.
Was that a hard day's night we nearly got then?
Yeah, exactly. Or This Is Pop, right? Because doesn't he just
Oh
go
yeah, it's very, very similar.
Yeah, I can't play XTC songs, they're too hard. I did
true.
put up the chords for Newtown Animal, and someone corrected it within a few days. So I was like, well, I tried. Oh, well.